dos seguidos, ¿no? Perdón, pero el panelista que sigue, tuvo que ir al baño. ¿Tú tenés? Dale, sí, ya estaba, dale, no. Preferible. Arrancamos entonces con el panel.
So we are going to start with the next music catalogs purchases. Why markers high interest? We will have one panelist on Zoom, and we will have the presentation. Music catalogs purchases. Why markets high interest? Parlisa Kelly, Chief of Legal and Commercial Affairs in Harbor View Equity at the United States. Matt Finkelstein, the partner of Info Shift at United States. Moderator, Federico Fisher, Associate of Fisher Abogados, Uruguay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you and welcome to ASIPI, the panelists, and to the organizers, especially to Marco Antonio Palacios for his invitation. Of course, thank you so much for you being here, attending, and to keep going. And I promise I won't let you down. Well, the panel is going to be in English language because Matt and Elisa are from the United States. So once we start, that we have.
How are you? Thank you so much.
Everybody's here waiting for your panel. So we're gonna conduct this panel in English, and the topic we're gonna address is the music catalog acquisitions. Why the market's high interest. So we've been hearing about this topic since at least the past years, and more so after the pandemic started. And we can say that it is a hot topic in the music industry. And it is a topic which is getting even hotter. Just for reference, last week there was an announcement of rumors of the catalog of Freddie Mercury and Queen, a potential acquisition for $1 billion. Yeah, you heard correctly. $1 billion for the acquisition of a single catalog of a band and an artist. But how did we get here? I mean, to this stage in where music labels, investment funds, and pension funds are looking at music as a potential asset and interest. So to address the ins and outs of this phenomenon, we have two amazing panelists, Matt and Palisa. So we're going to start by asking Matt and Palisa, how did we get here? You know, why is music such an amazing thing and which has sparked so much interest from the industry now? So I don't know if you can show the PPT.
Thank you, Federico. And hello again, everybody. So why music? One of the quotes that I like the most that resonates with me when thinking about music is a quote from Quincy Jones, the famous producer, probably most well known for producing some of Michael Jackson's biggest records. And what he says is there are two things you can't live without: water and music. The current chief executive of Warner Music Group, which is the third largest music company in the world, he describes music as thriving at the intersection of culture, technology, and commerce. It's the single most influential global art form with an unmatched ability to attract audiences, drive social interaction, transcend borders, and unite people. And for those of you in the audience who were able to make it out of bed this morning after celebrating last night, if you think back upon the great celebration from last night, music really played such a key role in the social interactions that occurred last night. In order to talk about where we are today in the music marketplace, it's important to have an understanding of where we've come over the past 20, 25 years, because there's been a real change to the music business. At the height of the music business in 1999, when people were buying CDs, in the United States, the recorded music business hit an overall revenue height at $14.6 billion. In 2000, CD sales alone were $13.2 billion. But if you fast forwarded just 10 years later to 2010, because of the use of technology, digital file sharing, the business shrunk by more than half to $6.6 billion. And at that point, digital consumption had begun, and it started to stabilize from digital downloads. By 2013, the sale of physical product had reduced to about 35% of the sales of music, while on the digital side it increased to 40% of overall sales. And by 2015, in the United States, record labels continued to see a decline in physical revenue, but they started to see a greater increase in digital revenue from digital downloads, from streaming, from ringtones and ringbacks, which at one time were a big thing, so that the digital revenue had increased from $230 million in 2004 to $4.8 billion in 2015. Part of what the trend that began in that time is to see consumers started to have more of a focus on the digital single, on digital downloads, less of an emphasis on buying digital albums, physical albums. And so we start to see a shift in consumer behavior away from album format to single format. And this ties in a little bit to the streaming music business today. So 2016 was a really important year, because that's the year where in the recorded music business, as a result of streaming revenues became the majority revenue source for the recorded music business for the first time. And so from there, it's really taken off from double-digit growth year over year, just about every year since then. It was at $7.6 billion in 2016 in the United States, almost $4 billion of which was attributable to streaming revenue. And you can see on this graphic behind me how over the course of, since the late 1970s to today, the different ways that music has been acquired or consumed. And what's really interesting is that we hit a point in 2016 where music, instead of being acquired, people going to the store and buying the physical product, the access model, where people are paying a monthly fee to access music, became the dominant form as to how music is consumed. Almost in a way, you can compare it in a way to, like Quincy Jones was talking about water. It's almost like become a utility. You pay your monthly electrical bill and you pay your monthly music subscription fee. today, if you take a look at this chart behind me, you'll see that in 2022, the global recorded music industry, according to the International Federation for the recording business, hit $26.2 billion, which was a 9% increase over 2021. And a really interesting note, and it correlates to some things we're going to talk about a little bit later. If you take a look at the years of the pandemic, the chart continues to increase. Revenues continue to increase, which is very different than most of the rest of the world, which shut down. So that really showed investors the resiliency of music and streaming in particular, and how the consumption of music isn't necessarily correlated to other factors in the world. Now, Police is going to talk a little bit about the world revenue and music publishing business.
Thanks, Matt. As you'll see from this graphic, earnings on music revenue have actually increased around the world. Most notably in Latin America, you will see that there was a 25.9% increase in Latin America. And I don't know if you can read the language below, but in each territory of Latin America experienced double-digit growth. And you'll also see in sub-Saharan Africa a significant increase as well, 34.7%. And that, I believe, that has led some companies to take a bigger interest in African music as well. You may have read that some companies are opening offices in Africa and increasing their A&R people there, partly as a result of statistics such as this. Going to the next slide, talking about music publishing revenue. On the publishing side, U.S. revenues have increased an average of 15.1% a year since 2015 to over $4.7 billion reported for 2021, according to the NMPA, the National Music Publishers Association. Performance royalties contributed over 51% of that total, and mechanical royalties over 18.5%, both of those driven largely by digital streaming activity. Universal Music Group, the record company, reported digital revenues rose by nearly 50% in its publishing division to over 1 billion euros. Overall, Universal's Music Group's revenues grew 21.6% to 10.34 billion euros for all of 2022, boosted by strong returns from the recorded music, subscriptions, and streaming. Going to the next U.S. major, Sony Music and Sony Music Publishing reported that for the first quarter of 2023, it had revenues of about $483 million, up 22.17% year over year. And that's for its 2022 fiscal year. And Warner Music Group reported that for the quarter ended March 31st, 2023, music publishing revenue rose 12% to $257 million from $230 million in the prior year. So clearly all of the major music publishers and indie publishers as well have experienced a huge boost in revenues. In the UK last week, the Mechanical Copyright Protection Society, MCPS, said that its member distributions increased by 232 million US dollars in 2022. That was the highest payout total since 2007. In the US, for mechanical royalties payable for on-demand streaming, the Copyright Royalty Board issued a determination for the Phonorecords III proceeding that maintains an up to 44% increase for U.S. songwriters and publishers' headline rate for mechanicals, by the end of the period 2018 to 2022, and I believe that headline rate was 15.1%. In December of 2022, the Copyright Royalty Board approved another settlement in the Phonorecords IV proceeding, which set the headline rate for 2023 to 2027 at a minor increase above the prior period. In February of 2023, the Mechanical Licensing Collective, the MLC as it's known, they administer blanket mechanical licenses that became available to digital service providers in the United States as of January 1st, 2021, had distributed more than $1 billion in mechanical royalties since its inception. As we'll see on this next graphic, investment in music rights has actually, increased significantly. You'll see from 2015 to 2021, we're up to $12 billion in combined music catalog M&A and investment into music rights companies or catalog acquisition funds. Again, much as we've seen from the prior slides, this is the result of the increase in payouts on the publishing side, and an increase in consumption of music by the general consumer.
And what we see here is a research company, Media Research, which does a lot of work in the music space. They predicted that by 2030, the recorded music revenues will grow to slightly over $73.3 billion. So that's quite a jump from where we're at today. And even if that might be a little bit too rosy and over-projected, it's still a lot of growth, which helps to paint the picture further as to music catalogs becoming a mainstream asset class for investments. So we thought what we would do today, this topic is a little different than some other topics in terms of telling you about the latest state of the law. It's really more about what's going on in the business. So we thought we would have a conversation and talk about certain topics. Perhaps they'll cover some questions you have, and then at the end, if we have some time, we can open up for questions to the audience.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess all in all, it's a good time to own or to think about owning music. So with this picture, with this scenario, I don't know, Matt or Palisa, if you can tell us about which are the types of music catalogs which are being bought. Is there any specific kind of music that the fans and the labels are looking into? Maybe Matt, you can start.
Sure. Well, I think it really depends upon who the buyer is and what their target is. Overall, I think there are some important elements that everybody's aware of that goes into determination of, no matter what the genre of music is, there's some basic fundamental issues that any company is going to be concerned about. And we're here today to talk about, this is an intellectual property related conference. And copyright law plays a really big role in the catalog acquisition business. So, whether it might be in investing in the Queen catalog or something more recent like Justin Bieber, whether someone is buying copyrights or just royalty streams, how copyright law plays a role is really the lifeblood of these, in my view, the lifeblood of these transactions, because someone who is an investor needs to understand how long of a life will the music that I'm buying or that I'm buying royalty streams related to, will there be? For example, with the Queen catalog, and this is something that I maybe question a little bit in terms of the valuations, the recordings for some of the hit Queen songs date back to the early to mid 70s. And in some of the territories throughout the world, that means that in 50 years or 70 years in the case of the United Kingdom, the recordings will go into the public domain. The compositions will live on longer. So an investor is going to want to know what is the duration of copyright related to the compositions or the recordings that are going to drive the revenue streams. In terms, and there are also, we can talk a little bit maybe later about, in the United States, risks related to authors or their families being able to recapture rights in the United States copyright and take them away from the current owners. So, you know, whether it's an investment in music in Latin America or in Africa or the United States, there's some baseline elements that no matter what the territory is, a buyer is going to want to know. And one of those relates to, you know, to the copyright law.
Yeah. I guess you cannot get it wrong with Shakira, at least. And so one of the very few Latin artists which has been involved in one of these transactions. And Palisa, do you agree with Matt? Do you have any additional thoughts?
I do. On the first question about the type of music that you know, investment funds or companies or publishing companies want to buy, I think initially the focus was on you know, in the United States, the sort of old rock music from the 70s. They were around for a while. They had a long history of earnings that were, you know, easily analyzable. And with the onset of digital radio, the earnings just kept increasing. And as we saw in the graphics with streaming has become a huge source of income. So I think initially that was a lot of the focus for these purchases. But as we like to say at Harborview, you know, everyone has a soundtrack to their life, no matter where you are in the world. So I think people are understanding that as we, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, earnings have increased, and there's a soundtrack there. There's music there that people enjoy, and that earns money, and that can also be analyzed, and that also earns, and that can also be invested in. So I think as this business grows, buyers are understanding that the genres of music, and Latin music, by the way, I mean, Latin music is sort of, you know, the it genre these days. Everyone's very interested in it. You just mentioned Shakira. Regional Mexican music is another popular one. And I think people are understanding that all genres of music have people that follow them, that enjoy them, that pay for it. And I think that that will expand. People investing in different types of music will expand as other buyers begin to realize that.
Yeah, maybe Matias and Martin, after yesterday's performance at the party, may stand a chance. And Palisa, from the copyright aspect, what do you feel that are the key issues to take into account?
I definitely echo what Matthew said. You know, in the United States, the reversion right under the U.S. copyright law, sections 203 and 304, are very important for buyers to look at because that gives the author the right to basically recapture their copyright ownership interest. And that was basically negotiated as sort of a balance. That Congress understood that when a lot of these artists enter into these agreements, they may not have as much leverage to negotiate deals that would allow them the benefit of their songs or allow them the best royalty rates. And as a compromise, they negotiated in this right to recapture their copyrights, which gives them an opportunity to either continue with their current publisher or renegotiate better rates or take their copyrights elsewhere. And I think it's, you know, as long as you're aware of that, and obviously it's something that buyers look at, and how close you are to that time that you're allowed to exercise that right is obviously baked into the price, and, you know, may affect how the deal is structured. But yes, as Matt said, it's obviously underlying every one of these deals because copyright is the foundation of these deals, and that is something that definitely has to be taken into consideration.
For sure.
Right, and if, I'm sorry, if I could add to that. So as an example, if a buyer hires us to do due diligence work as part of a transaction, they will want to know not only how long will the copyright last, but as Pelisa was mentioning, at what point in time will the copyrights perhaps be at risk of reverting? Because I might be buying revenue streams to one of the biggest bands, but they're revenue streams because there's a record label that owns those recordings. And so if I'm, for example, thinking that I'm going to be receiving royalties from Warner Music Group for the rest of perpetuity because they currently own the recordings, well, what if in 10 years the band members or their families exercise termination rights? What will happen? Will the United States income have a really big dip, and how will that impact my investment? And oftentimes that plays a role into structuring the deal. Are we going to, if a songwriter or an artist hasn't served notices of termination, maybe the buyer wants them to do that now and try to renegotiate things with the existing publisher or record label to make sure that revenue streams continue as long as possible, to help to minimize the risk of revenues declining as a result of copyright terminations.
Thanks, Matt. And in this conference, we have been talking a lot about valuation. So can you share some thoughts about how is the purchase price determined and how the assets are valuated here?
Sure. Pelisa, do you want to lead the way since you're at Harborview and I can supplement?
No problem. I will talk generally about the valuation process, not specifically Harborview, but I think most buyers look at the same things. Obviously, it's the weighted age of the copyrights, the assets that you're looking at. As I mentioned before, if something's been around for 20, 30 years and has a demonstrated earnings history, that is a much stronger track record than assets that have been around for 3, 5, 10 years. So basically, the age of the assets is definitely something to look at. Obviously, the earnings, no matter how old the assets are, the earnings are also something that we look at, and it's got to be the sort of the earnings, the recurring earnings. We can't, if someone's making a lot of money, but it's based on, say, for instance, synchronization income, which is basically if something is used in a movie or in a television show, that is something that wouldn't be recurring every year. That's a one-time event. So as looking at the earnings, you sort of have to normalize the earnings to make sure that they are basically earnings that are recurring, and that's performance income, streaming income, and try to create an average earnings scenario that you can look at and use to base your purchase price on. Also, another factor which we discussed is the age of the copyrights and whether or not the owners will be able to recapture those copyrights at some point. That is also obviously a big factor. The genre of the music also plays a part, just in terms of earnings patterns, and that is also something that they look at. And a lot of companies say, music publishers or record companies, say if they're looking at a Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen, they will also, since they've got sort of everything housed under one umbrella, they will also be able to look at future exploitation opportunities, since they have actually had those assets in their company for so long, and they will actually be able to factor in other future possibilities for the uses of those assets, and that's also something that's considered.
And I'll add to that, and this relates back to copyright, is whether the buyer is going to have control. So somebody might be buying a copyright interest in a musical composition, but it might be owned in part by a Sony Music Publishing or Universal Music Publishing and subject to the administration rights of another party. And so to the extent that somebody has control, to create their own revenue streams based upon their efforts, that plays a factor into the valuation. Similarly, if there's no copyright interest being acquired and it's just what some would refer to as a passive income stream, am I going to, as a buyer, pay the same amount of money as I would as if I was buying the copyright and had really full control? And different buyers take different perspectives. Sometimes they'll pay less because they're not buying the copyright, but others say, well, some of these companies that currently control the rights, they have millions of recordings, millions of songs, so they can't really focus on these particular assets. We can. And so if we create opportunities for use of music in film or television and bring it to the existing owner, is that existing owner really going to turn it down? Probably not. And so some take a look at the passive income stream as really not necessarily being a passive investor in terms of managing the investor going forward, managing the investment going forward. Similarly, because some of these recordings and compositions have been part of massive catalogs, what opportunities for growth might there be if somebody who has a more bespoke or boutique hands-on approach and doesn't have as many copyrights, what can they do to help grow and create opportunities? What markets are available? I was doing a transaction for a seller, a recording group, and one of the pitches that I made to help when I was negotiating the price to help increase what the buyer was offering, I gave an example of, here's a use where this song was used for mental health purposes. And it just so happened that that buyer had a category in its metrics for valuation that mental health was a market. And so that bumped up, I won't say by how much, but that had an appreciable increase in the purchase price amount and helped get it to the point where the sellers were satisfied with the purchase price that was being offered. Tied into streaming, what's really I find really interesting is that you can look at a Spotify account and see where all the users are coming from throughout the world. And so you might have a US-based artist or recording group, and you could see that there's really an opportunity outside of the United States, because the use of the internet, streaming, as you saw in I think there's a correlation to the global chart that Pelisa talked about earlier in terms of growth rates. The United States, the growth rate has slowed down a little bit as compared to the rest of the world, which is now becoming more large adapters of Wi-Fi, internet, and really just beginning to come online and use streaming services. So if there's an opportunity to really grow a catalog outside of the United States, that's a factor as well.
Thanks, Matt. So getting into the deal in itself, how do you think, what are the common obstacles that you face usually in those deals? So can you tell us a little bit more about the structuring of the deal in itself?
Sure. So I think one thing that's important to understand is, what are buyers buying? Because some of the deals that you've read about in the headlines, the David Bowies, the Bruce Springsteens, what are the copyrights or income streams that are being bought? Because that ties into the obstacles that might be faced in a deal. So for example, with David Bowie, he sold his song publishing catalog, his music publishing catalog, for reported close to $400 million. Bruce Springsteen, which was reported to be over $500 million, that was a combination of recording income and his music publishing catalog. There are, on the songwriting side of things, in addition to the copyrights, there are also, even if a songwriter doesn't own a copyright interest, there are public performance royalties that are generated by the public performance of musical compositions. So songwriters often include in the transactions the sale of the songwriter's share of public performance royalties. And on the recorded music side of things, there are neighboring rights royalties, which is a newer concept in the United States, but have been around much longer for the rest of the world, right? And so that's a growing source of revenue to artists that gets paid directly to the performers, and has increasingly become a part of the overall pot of revenue that that's being acquired. So if you think about an investment company who might be buying a revenue stream from generated by a recording artist whose recordings are currently controlled by an existing company like Sony Music or Universal, there's probably going to be a component of looking to see whether there's a restriction against assignment, so that the existing record label has approval rights over whether the artist can actually transfer the right to receive income. And in many instances, and I would say in most instances, there is that restriction. And so I'd say maybe 3-4 years ago that became more of a challenge. It was more of a challenge in terms of record companies saying, no, we're not going to allow it to happen. But now, because there's such a demand and they want to try to placate the artists who are still signed to the record labels, they will permit the assignment of income. But different buyers are going to have different standards for what it is they want to see to gain comfort that the existing owner of the music is going to be paying the money through to the buyer. And in most instances, it's really a challenge, because what the existing owner will say is, we're going to pay, we recognize that there was a sale transaction, we're going to pay money to the buyer, but we're not in business with the buyer. The buyer is going to have no contractual rights, so if we're paying royalties to the buyer, they really constitute royalties that are being paid to you as the recording artist. So if there's a dispute, there's going to be no right for the buyer to audit the record company or audit the publishing company. So the buyer is then stuck in a position of having to make sure to, when it's doing its agreements with the seller, to make sure that the seller agrees that it will act as a front to interface with the publishing company or the record company to initiate the audit at the expense of the buyer. And so that means there needs to be ongoing cooperation with the seller, where in many instances the sellers might just want to cash out and not be involved with those particulars. So those are challenges that are faced by buyers. Similarly, approval rights. When someone's spending tens of millions of dollars to buy a catalog, what rights of approval might the songwriter or recording artist maintain over the use of the music in a film or commercial or television program? That's something that often gets negotiated, and depending upon the leverage and relationship among the buyers and sellers, the seller might maintain some rights or might maintain very little rights. But there's also a concern about these assets being subject to pre-existing agreements with a music publisher or a recording artist and their approval rights there. And how is that going to work if the record company or music publishing company doesn't recognize the buyer as a contractual party? That seller is going to, or a representative of the seller, is going to need to continue to be in the midst the relationship. I just got a text yesterday from a client who sold their catalog, and they said, I want to stop receiving these notices about potential uses for approval of the recordings. And what happened there is while the existing record label honored the assignment of royalty income, they said, we're not going to talk to our competitor that just bought this catalog to seek approvals. So it's a challenge. The integration of the catalog and how it's all going to work afterwards plays a role in terms of how you set up the deal ahead of time.
So very complex, and I guess every transaction is their own world and with their own particularities. So Palisa, I want to ask you about what are the different types of revenue streams being sold in these deals. Matt already mentioned something which may be out of the ordinary, as like the medical music, but what is your perspective, your experience on this?
Yeah, Matt already mentioned the sale of the actual, on the composition side, the sale of the actual composition, or sale of the publishing royalties if the composition is not being assigned, which encompasses synchronization rights, mechanical uses, public performance, which Matt mentioned, and as well as the songwriter share of public performance income, and the public performance of the musical composition if you are owning the composition. On the recorded music side, we are talking about either generally master royalties income from the artist. There are also producer royalties that are an asset class that if you've got a huge producer who has been working with a big artist, those royalties can also be significant. And then you've got the sound exchange income, the neighboring rights income in the United States, that's sound exchange. Both on the label side, if you are able to buy the copyright in the actual master, and on the featured artist side, which goes to the performer. And also for the producer often is entitled to a portion of the neighboring rights income as well. And then some sort of newer areas are name and likeness rights, merchandising rights, and in our case in Harborview, we actually not only do we invest in music, we also invest in other areas of media. So we actually acquired a film company. So we're able to use those rights in connection with other areas of entertainment that we have made purchases. So that is something that has also become a very popular source of income. And artwork, if you're actually buying masters, if you're in a position to buy masters, which usually the record labels, own those. We can talk about whether or not their works for hire or if they're actually owned by the record label. But if you actually have a case where you're able to buy the copyright in the master, then the artwork is another asset that you would be purchasing, the liner notes, the artwork, everything that went along with that, so that when you buy it and as a buyer and then you distribute those yourself, you have the right to use that artwork as well. And I think I mentioned name and likeness too. Yeah. Those are sort of the major areas right now that people are getting into.
Yeah, and I'm sure more and more areas will come up, especially with technology and how the world evolves. So just to finalize, I would like if you both, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, can share a little bit about what you see that the market is now and how the market will evolve. Do you think that the market is as robust as it was before? Do you think the interest change, the rates, the change in the interest rates had an effect on the marketplace? And how do you see the future for these music acquisitions? Matt or Palisa, want to chime in?
I'll start from a buyer perspective. I think the question in everyone's mind when rates were low was how long will this last and what happens when rates go up. But what you know, personally, what I've seen is that you know, the market is still robust. There are still a lot of artists interested in selling their assets, and obviously buyers are there. I think buyers who were there not for the long term have sort of fallen away from the market as the interest rates have risen, but the buyers who are really committed to this asset class are still here. And obviously there's been an adjustment in the purchase price, but there are still artists willing to enter the marketplace for whatever, you know, whatever their own personal reasons are. They're still willing to enter the marketplace right now. And I think it's also been an opportunity for, like, as we discussed, other genres of music, for people to really look at other areas of music, to see what's out there and to see, you know, what the diamonds in the rough are as far as different genres to invest in. Some of the bigger artists, you know, 100 million, 200 million artists may continue to sit on the sidelines. They don't have a huge incentive to buy. There's no, you know, there's nothing forcing them to sell. I'm sorry, there's nothing forcing them to sell. So I've seen a couple of those sort of sit back to wait and see what the interest rates do. But otherwise, the market is still very strong.
Thank you, Balisa. Matt, do you agree? You have different views?
I absolutely agree with Balisa. I think the market's very robust and it will stay for a while, and in particular because of the attractiveness of music as a mainstream asset class. And what we have is there are many more buyers in the marketplace in the past couple of years. So, you know, I would say just in the past couple of months, I've experienced, you know, I've worked for both buyers and sellers, and on the sell side of things, I'd say that there are more and more inquiries coming from new buyers in the marketplace seeking opportunities for catalogs. And these buyers are not necessarily ones who want to get into a competitive bidding process and pay huge multiples for their, so they're seeking based upon relationships to trying to get into situations where they'll pay a healthy price but not necessarily be involved in you know, in competition against some of the established players who are willing to really shell out money and have maybe a better infrastructure to be able to exploit the assets that are acquired. And Balisa mentioned something about long-term investment. That's really what's been the game changer, is that you have music being seen as something that's almost like an annuity. It continues to throw off cash in return for an investment. And maybe at the end of the day, that asset, the music asset that's been acquired, will appreciate in value if it's going to be sold at a later point in time. But in the interim, there is significant amounts of money that are being earned. They're not necessarily the high double digits that some private equity firms would expect and then might cash out on their investments in a 3 to 7 year horizon, which is something that I observed in the last time there was sort of a little bit of a flurry was maybe in the 2008, 2009 area, where private equity firms were getting involved, but they were not in it for the long haul. They were in it to cash out. And here I think we have a combination of family office money, which has started some companies that have actually wound up going public, like in the example of Round 2 Music on the London Stock Exchange. But these are investors who are in it over the long haul. Big investment companies like KKR, companies like PIMCO, which are more used to doing things tied to bonds, which throw off income over a long period of time. And speaking of bonds, that's also why some of these investment companies that have invested, you know, over $1 billion in these assets have in turn issued bonds to investors, you know, to make back their money. And so that's also added to the attractiveness of music as an investable asset class.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Palisa. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about this topic in the coming years. And thank you for the great overview and for sharing your experience and all your knowledge in regards to this topic. So we have run out of time. We probably don't have time for questions. Well, yeah, we can have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if anyone has something to ask, please go ahead. Yes, Ricardo.
Thank you both. Great presentation on an area that is fascinating and so current. I wanted to ask you about termination rights. I know that Matt and I have, spoken at length about this and how, since the transformation in the industry, the streaming rights, and the increased value, that suddenly the artists now are using more and more this figure, this notice. So I know, that in Latin America, you have joy de suit or, more rights, but since in the States, you don't have, joy de suit per se, then how, the termination rights, a quick explanation of how they work and how they're impacting, this industry and these deals.
That's a good question. And one thing to make clear is that the termination rights are not just for U.S. citizens. They generally apply to authors of all nationalities who can exercise their rights under the copyright law. And as Palisa mentioned, there's 2 different statutes, there's 2 different sections within the copyright law. So depending upon when an author transferred their rights to a publisher or record company, there's a different time regime for when those rights can be exercised. For transfers that were made prior to 1978, it's 56 years from the date the copyright was secured. So what we're talking about is recordings and compositions from the late 60s, early 70s, which are really ripe right now and at risk if you're an owner for termination. And then for transfers that were made on or after January 1, 1978, it's generally 35 years from the date that the work was first published under the grant. So we're talking about the mid 80s right now, which are mid to late 80s, where artists and songwriters can get back their works. And it's really, I've witnessed firsthand working for artists and songwriters recapturing their rights and helping them to then do what was designed by the copyright law to give creators or their families a second bite at the apple, because it's allowed them to renegotiate their deals with an existing record label if they don't want to fight over whether something's a work made for hire, and increase their royalty rates. And same thing on the music publishing side. And then ultimately decide, do they want to be in the business of managing their rights or maybe capitalize and sell in such a robust marketplace?
Thanks, Matt. I don't know if anyone else has a question. I don't see any hands, but maybe Palisa, you wanna add something to what Matt said? Very short.
No, nothing to add. Just to remind people that that applies to the United States. So if you're looking at income, who the significant amount of which is outside of the United States, it might be less impactful. If you're looking at something whose earnings are predominantly in the United States, it may have more of an impact. So often, people, I just like to remind people that that right is really exercisable in the United States, and you should even dig deeper to look at the earnings and where they are concentrated to see how much that would affect the particular asset stream that you're looking at.
Okay, great. Thank you, Palisa, and of course, we're gonna close the panel. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Palisa, again, and thanks for this amazing overview of this amazing topic, which is the purchase of music catalogs.
Thank you.
Gracias. Okay. Valisa, please stay. We're going to take a picture with you.
Okay.
Muchas gracias. Ahí va.